Welcome to the debate. Today, we are diving into, well, a pretty major market phenomenon that seems to have really shaken up consumer trust, the de-influencing trend. It mostly started, I think, out of frustration on platforms like TikTok. We're seeing creators actively campaigning against buying these overhyped, often overpriced products.
Right. It's presented as this ultimate pushback against, manufactured desire, which, okay, on the surface sounds fantastic. But I think we really have to question whether this whole inversion of the marketing model actually holds up under scrutiny.
Yeah, that is the core tension, isn't it? So our central question today, is the de-influencing movement a genuine positive market correction? Is it permanently fixing business practices by demanding transparency and, frankly, better quality? Or is it maybe just a disingenuous sort of bandwagony extension of the same old influencing game that doesn't really solve the core problems of consumerism? I'm firmly arguing this movement is a seismic shift. It's forcing businesses towards integrity and ultimately better products.
And I'm coming at this from, well, a slightly different angle. While the intent, reducing waste, promoting sustainable spending, cutting through all that marketing noise, that intent is absolutely laudable, yeah? But the execution, I think the execution has often been very poor. It frequently feels deeply hypocritical, often shifts the responsibility away from the consumer, and it just fails to bring in the nuance needed for actual useful product critique.
Okay, I see why you're focusing on execution, but let me try and frame this change by its sheer scale and, honestly, its necessity. De-influencing. It's not just a fleeting fad, right? It's a powerful market mechanism. It's directly challenging this, over $16 billion influencer industry. This is a quantifiable collective rejection of the old ways. That hashtag de-influencing hashtag, it just exploded over 600 million views by early 2023. That kind of velocity alone, it signals a direct, pretty organized challenge to the old model of just manufactured hype.
Okay. The numbers definitely show widespread consumer frustration. I'll absolutely grant you that. But frustration isn't automatically structural change.
But the shift feels sustainable because the drivers are both economic and emotional. We're seeing huge economic anxiety fueling this. There was a report saying 76% of Gen Z consumers cite financial stress as a real motivation for consuming this kind of content. People are just tired, I think, of being fooled into buying ineffective, expensive junk, especially when budgets are tight. They're demanding content that actually protects their wallet.
That economic driver is compelling, I agree. It certainly gives the movement some weight.
And the market seems to be rewarding this honesty. We're seeing brands that get mentioned positively as, worthy alternatives in de-influencing content. They're seeing conversion rate increases around 32%. So quality and honesty are being rewarded very publicly, and this is forcing corporations to respond. 62% of brands reported reformulating products after facing significant public criticism. When actual product formulas are changing in response, well, that demonstrates structural impact, doesn't it? Not just, online noise.
I appreciate the data showing brands are reacting, yeah, but I do worry that the way the content itself is structured kind of undermines that positive intent you're talking about. The earliest videos, which I actually loved, they focused on consumer responsibility. Creators would show a drawer packed with 50 red lipsticks they never used, admitting they bought into the hype, and they encouraged the viewer to just pause their own consumption. They put the onus back on the buyer to be mindful.
And that kind of self-reflection is definitely a good first step, sure.
But it turned so quickly, didn't it? That introspection just vanished, and it devolved into this sort of hate brigade online, which often just became an easy way to remove all responsibility from the purchasers themselves. Instead of the message being, hey, think critically about your impulse buys, the implicit message felt like it became, oh, those greedy influencers made you buy it. We can't ignore that ultimately we are all responsible for the consumption choices we make.
I might frame that shift in blame a bit differently. Maybe it's a necessary targeting of the source of the misleading information. If the supply of bad recommendations dries up, Isn't the consumer naturally better off?
Perhaps, but the execution often embraces the exact same problem it claims to solve. Over-dramatization just to get clicks. The irony is just unavoidable. Saying, don't buy product X because it's trash, well, that is absolutely still a form of influencing. It's an active push to shape someone's decision. And the trend completely lost the plot, I think, when creators started using it competitively. Basically saying, okay, don't buy this hype product, but definitely buy this specific one instead.
You've raised a really interesting point there about sensationalism. But isn't that noise maybe a necessary evil? Isn't it needed to actually break through the sheer volume of relentless marketing we're all subjected to today?
Maybe. But the execution feels identical to the hype machine it's supposedly fighting against. The content is driven by the algorithm, right? It rewards these sensationalized takes, immediate, extreme reactions. If a foundation is being hyped, the counter video just screams, "This product sucks, it's a total lie," without even acknowledging a basic truth. Different products work differently for different people. There's just no in-between. No discussion about, say, foundation for oily skin versus dry skin, or shampoo for high-porosity hair versus low porosity. That lack of nuance in the critique ends up being just as misleading, potentially, as the original overhyped review.
That's a compelling argument about the content format itself, definitely. But I would argue that the dramatic reaction is actually a proportionate response to a complete, utter breakdown of trust. Consumer confidence in traditional influencer recommendations absolutely plummeted. It went from something like 63% down to just 38% over 5 years. And this was definitely accelerated by those high-profile scandals. Like, remember the massive criticism influencers got over that Tarte trip to Dubai, where all that luxury travel just looked like pay-to-play? Or the huge controversies around Mascaragate, where creators were pretty clearly caught faking results?
Okay, yes, we can definitely agree that consumer trust was severely damaged. That's clear.
So when trust is that eroded, consumers demand content that just cuts through the noise with, like, explicit honesty. The sensationalism you're criticizing, it might not just be an algorithmic fluke. It could be a symptom of widespread advertising fatigue. Something like 86% of consumers report feeling totally burnt out by traditional ads. People are just desperate, I think, for content that feels explicitly, even dramatically honest, just to prove it's not another sponsored lie.
But let's look closer at that second point, shifting responsibility. If consumers are apparently so savvy now that they demand honesty, shouldn't we also demand they take responsibility for their own critical thinking? I'd argue that treating influencers as just easy targets or scapegoats, it removes the necessary focus from the consumer's own role in the equation.
I disagree that it removes focus. I see de-influencing as the consumer exercising their responsibility, but by leveraging their collective purchasing power. They're essentially voting with their wallets, right? Products that get criticized in these viral videos, they face real sales declines, up to 43% in some cases. This collective action forces brands towards transparency. We're seeing companies that provide clearer info about sourcing, about ingredients, and they're seeing like 56% higher customer retention rates. The consumers are being responsible by creating pressure points where it actually impacts the bottom line.
But where does the hypocrisy really come into play? You mentioned earlier that competitive nature. Don't buy this instead. That alternative product being pushed, it's often linked using affiliate codes, or maybe there are brand partnerships that aren't always disclosed as clearly as, well, they really should be.
So are you suggesting the core criticism is actually less about the product quality and more about just redirecting commissions?
Exactly. If a creator's main motivation for telling you product X sucks so bad is really just to make sure you click their affiliate link for product Y, then the whole cycle is still driven by profit, isn't it? Not by purity or genuine advice. We, as the audience, we have to remember we are responsible for our own consumption. We shouldn't just buy a serum because one creator uses it, and we certainly shouldn't rush out and buy the competitor product simply because a different creator tells us not to buy the first one. We need to bring back critical thinking and stop just believing everybody's hype, whether the message is buy this or don't buy that.
Okay, but that requires an enormous amount of mental labor from the consumer, doesn't it? In an already completely saturated market. If the pressure forces brands to simply produce demonstrably better products in the first place, then maybe the consumer has less detective work to do to figure out quality. But let's move to longevity. Is this just a fleeting trend, or is it really structural change?
I question the lasting impact precisely because of that missing context we talked about. So many creators are still just making videos about products they personally didn't like, and they're failing to serve their audience with any real nuance. If a product works horribly for me, let's say a super liquidy, oily foundation on my already oily skin, well, an ethical review requires me to disclose that, hey, this might actually be perfect for someone with really dry skin. Just declaring a product trash because of personal preference without any context, that just creates a whole new wave of misinformation. Without that nuance, yeah, I think the trend feels fleeting.
I appreciate the call for ethical context. I really do. But I think the change is structural, regardless of individual creator failing sometimes. The whole value proposition has shifted dramatically. Today, something like 82% of successful brands are emphasizing function, tangible utility, over just manufactured status or social cachet. This focus on genuine efficacy that feels like a permanent shift in consumer demand, largely led by Gen Z.
A shift in stated focus, though, that's not a guarantee of long-term corporate behavior change. We've seen brands pay lip service to transparency plenty of times before.
But financial investment usually guarantees seriousness, right? Experts are actually predicting that by 2025, roughly 80% of traditional influencer marketing budgets will shift toward what they're calling authentic community building initiatives. Now, that represents a fundamental, likely permanent, reallocation of resources away from just blind hype and towards genuine utility and more sustainable business models. You don't shift 80% of your budget for something you think is just a fleeting trend.
That is a powerful prediction, I'll give you that. But I have to challenge the definition of authentic community building. Historically, that kind of corporate jargon often just means finding a slightly more subtle way to sell things. Is it truly structural change, or are brands just moving from obvious sponsorships to, highly targeted, maybe localized, and potentially emotionally manipulative marketing? The focus might still be on acquisition, just dressed up in new buzzwords.
Well, I stand by the evidence suggesting this movement signals a permanent, positive recalibration. Business models, I believe, now must prioritize product quality and honest communication over manufactured scarcity and hype. Gen Z is successfully demanding substance over style, and the market is demonstrably rewarding that integrity, like we saw with those higher retention rates.
And while the goal, reducing overconsumption, increasing transparency, is absolutely laudable, I do remain skeptical about the execution. Unless creators and consumers actively reintroduce nuance and critical thinking into the mix, and unless influencers stop co-opting the movement just for competitive promotion, moving beyond don't buy this other specific thing instead, then it just risks becoming this flawed, self-perpetuating loop of influencing, regardless of whether you stick D on the front.
It seems this discussion really highlights that crucial tension, doesn't it? Between the consumer's emotional demand for authenticity and the persistent, often profit-driven dynamics of market forces in this constantly evolving digital economy.
Indeed. The collective power of consumer feedback is undeniable now, but we definitely have to remain vigilant against simply swapping one kind of sensationalized hype for another.